Thank you everyone for joining us today for this deep dive. We are excited to dive into Skuid field properties. My name is Matt Brown, and I'm going to be leading us today. I've got Zach McElrath, our principal developer advocate. He is joining us remote and is going to be sharing and talking about a few things. Also here in the room, we've got Carl Sheffield, our product manager on the use team. We've got Josh Cutler representing the product content team. Josh, what's your title right now?
Manager of product content.
Manager of product content. He is our grand poobah of Skuid product content. Docs, tutorials. There's so much good stuff. So he's going to be basically spamming the chat with links to docs as we go. Because there's a lot of good stuff in there. I've also got Chris Stern, our pre-sales solutions engineer, and what we're talking about today, field properties, relates to pretty much what you do most days.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're building a lot of complex forms. I mean, there are a lot of things you can do with Skuid, and you build a lot of things with Skuid, but this really revolves a lot around data entry, and that's something where Skuid brings a lot of unique value. So I'm going to pick your brain on a few things as we go. Awesome. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. We've got a couple of slides to talk through some of the concepts, and then I want to spend most of our time in the Composer getting into the details of actually working with fields in Skuid. All right, so what are we talking about when we talk about field properties? Really, it comes from use cases like this, where you get a wireframe, from a designer, and it shows these kinds of experiences. The user needs to enter a picklist value, but they don't want it to be a dropdown. I just actually ran into that today in a requirement where they wanted it to to see all of the options and just be able to select from those. User needs to enter a value in a reference field, but they want it to be a drop-down pick list with type ahead. Or the user might have access to all 20 record types that you have in Salesforce, but for the purposes of this form, they only want to be able to see 5. Maybe on a text field, you want to get a length counter like you have on Twitter. You want to put some placeholder text in there. Many more examples like this, where for the design that you're working from, you've been asked to deliver behaviors, experiences that users expect from web apps that they're used to using. Anyways, we know that you get these, and Skuid lets you do all of this and more. It has a ton of options for how you can configure how fields look and behave, and the metadata that's in them as well. We have a ton of options. So before we get into that, just a quick refresh. I know that folks that are joining us might be coming from different levels of familiarity with Skuid. When I build with Skuid, I tend to think of the Skuid page as having 3 application layers there in the front end. And this is pulled from the idea of an MVC, a model view controller approach to front-end development, where you have essentially a data layer, you have a visual presentation layer that displays that data, and then you have a layer of logic and actions that are going to make that more dynamic. So thinking along those lines, and that's gonna come into play with what we're talking about with fields, because Skuid gives you a number of controls at each of those layers. You can determine how the field behaves just in the data layer, and then you also have control over how the field looks and behaves and works in the presentation layer as well. So if you're just new to getting into Skuid, the way Skuid works is when you build a Skuid page, you're going to create what's called a model that connects to data. It connects to data in a database. It could be Salesforce. It could be a SQL database. We're going to go pull that data. You're going to pick which fields you want to bring into that data layer and how many records. So if you're familiar with spreadsheets, we're talking about rows and columns. how many rows, how many columns do you want to bring in to that data layer from your data source? And that's called a model. And you can have as many models as you need in your page. So that's kind of the basic way that Skuid works underneath, the engine that's running it. Once you have that layer of data, then you can display that data in Skuid's components. And we have two main types of components. There are layout components, which let you break up the page into different sections. That's the layout structure of your page. Then the other type of component are data components that are pulling from that data layer to display it so that the user has access to it. They can see it. If they have, create, read, or create or update or delete access, they can actually take action on that data. And that's really going to be what we're going to be spending our time in today. We're going to be looking at data components like the field editor, the table, forms. We're displaying data to the end user that they can take action on. So that's kind of the basics of how Skuid works. But I was talking with Zach about it, and we were realizing that when you interact with fields in Skuid, you're actually interacting with several other layers of connections and properties of fields in a number of different places. So Zach, do you want to talk to us about kind of the architecture there of what we're interacting with when we interact with a field in Skuid?
Sure. So there's really a hierarchy in which metadata gets from different layers into the visual representation of a page. So where it starts at the very top of the hierarchy is the database or the data source, where you're defining the schema for the data that you're tracking. So for some of you who are using data sources, like a data source of Salesforce, that would be going into schema builder in Salesforce and creating custom objects or custom fields, or editing standard fields, or adding custom fields on standard objects. So that we'd call that like the database layer. And then you can also do that with other data sources, like a SQL database is another place that Skuid can connect to. If you have data in a Postgres database, MySQL, Microsoft SQL, things like that, you can define the schema there with things like migrations, which will write, alter table or statements to create new columns, modify the data types of your columns. So that's one place where Skuid gets metadata from, is going to the data source and saying, hey, what objects are available in this data source? So for Salesforce, that could be your standard objects, your custom objects. For SQL, that would be your tables, your views. Skuid will go to the data source, pull those in, and then get metadata about those objects and their fields. Now, the next place, once you've pulled that metadata in, within Skuid, I'm going to skip the first SQL only part here for a second, but typically what you do in Salesforce is you go to the Skuid page and then you go create a model. You say, well, what data object do I want to connect to? I want to connect to accounts. I want to connect to opportunities or a custom object. And then you can pick the fields on those objects that you want to have in your Skuid model. And then when you add, say, a table component or a field editor or form component in Skuid, or a chart, Skuid says, okay, you've selected to show data from opportunities in this table. And you just dragged in a field like the stage field. And I can tell by going to the model, and then the model gets data from Salesforce that this stage name is a picklist field. And that's what its scheme, that's what its metadata type is. But then there's an additional layer at which in Skuid you can say, here in this table component, I want to render that picklist data as something other than a picklist. I might want to render it as radio buttons. So choose the stage based on radio buttons. Or if it's a multi-select picklist field, I could render it as checkboxes. So there's different ways in which Skuid at the UI layer, you can modify the metadata of those fields that come from the database into the Skuid model. So there's various points with Skuid where you can override or alter how things look in the UI, how things behave, so that they don't function exactly as they come from the database. We'll show some of that here in a bit. The one other thing I'll touch on, just mention now, is that with SQL data sources, we have another layer in which we import your schema from your tables or views. And then we also let you define additional, we let you override metadata at a per object layer within Skuid. So you don't have to have a lot of complex database schema definition going on with enum fields necessarily. You can have some of that metadata defined within Skuid.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. I actually had to do that with one customer that was connecting to data from Microsoft SQL Server, and they had a metadata type called money, all caps. And Skuid's connector wasn't able to interpret that, but I was able to go into the data source objects and override that metadata to a currency type. And then basically all the different pages that pulled that field then looked at that data source object configuration where I had set the metadata type to currency. It was really great. It was everything I needed it to do. And I do want to say this is one of the first things that we looked at in depth in our first Nautilus notes. Ben Hubbard takes some time to look at DSOs. And so if you're interested in that, there's more on that. That's on the YouTube channel, and you can watch it. Cool. Zach, anything else about high level here, the architecture of fields that you want to speak to?
No, let's dive in. Let's go.
I love it.
Let's go into it.
All right, let's get into the composer here. So what I wanted to do for this deep dive was take some time to look at the different field properties in components, and then also look at the field properties at the data layer as well. So you get a sense of what's possible. And that's one of the, I think, the hardest things about Skuid is because there's so much functionality. A lot of the time it's just knowing what is possible out there. And I've run into this before where a customer has asked for a certain feature and I said, yeah, I think that's going to take some JavaScript. And Zach actually pointed out, nope, you can do that. That's just a field property. That was the combo box, which we looked at on Nautilus Notes last week. So let's take some time and look at these things. I'm going to go through and highlight some of the things that I think are really going to be useful and that maybe you didn't know were there. So let's start with some of the basic field properties. So if you spend much time with Skuid, you know that one of the patterns of using it is that you click on something and then you see its properties up in the property pane up here. And so that's true for our components, and it's also true for elements within those components. And so fields are one of those elements because you can put fields in a field editor, in a table, in a list, and you can then configure the properties for that field from within that component. And there are a number of properties that are always going to be there. And they're pretty handy. One of those is the custom label. So in Salesforce and other databases, you can determine what the label is for fields. But then there are going to be times where, maybe you want to change that for the sake of the user. One example I was looking at here for a new opportunities page was the price book entry ID field. That's not a very user-friendly label, and so I was able to just put a custom label in there on the table column so that makes sense to the user. And I think if you export a table, it'll export your custom labels as well if you do it there. So custom labels, pretty cool. There are other capabilities that you have on most fields. You can make most fields read-only or required. Now, this is on top of whatever your settings are at the database level. We'll never override those. So if the user doesn't have edit access on that field, you can't bypass that with Skuid. But if you want to make a field required because this particular process, you want to make sure that you don't lose that information. It's not so much a security model issue. It's just in this specific process, that's a control you want to have. That's where this can be helpful. Same thing with read-only. If it's just something, normally they have access to it, but for the purposes of what you're building, you just want to display it. we want to give you that ability to do it. Display logic is also going to be available on just about every field. And that is your render conditions and your enable conditions. And so you've got some options for how that logic works. We're not going to get too much into conditional rendering here. That's worthy. There already is a deep dive of that, I think, on our deep dive channel. But a lot you can do there. Enable conditions are really helpful if you want to essentially guide a user down a path of editing information. You can say only enable this field, if this criteria is met, if this other field has a value. And what's great about this too is you can put a message in there that says, if they try to edit it and they want to know, hey, why can't I edit this thing? They'll hover over it and it'll say, please fill out these required fields first, kind of thing. So there's a lot of options there for conditional rendering. The other thing I wanted to point out to here in the case of the table is the conditional rendering here is based on the column. And so you are applying render conditions to a whole column in a table based on certain criteria. In a field editor, the way that works is it really is just on the field. And that's how you can get that kind of self-building form experience of I fill out this field and then this one shows, as opposed to seeing another one if you had entered in a value of, B instead of A. So a lot of cool things with display logic there. And there are a number of properties that are going to be available across all fields. All right, so that's kind of across the board, but the cool thing about field properties is you get different options depending on the field type. Sometimes wildly different options, because the way the data behaves is very, very different based on the type of data that is being put in there. So the first kind of basic list of properties that I want to look at are those related to string and text fields. So if I click on the name, which is a string field, we can see that, oh yeah, sorry. Okay, cool. Yeah, so we're just making sure that everyone can see everything here. Josh is sending out. Are you able to do that? Post to all attendees?
You just had a default setup. Yeah.
There we go. Cool. So we got our first docs link of the day, which goes into to some of these things. Awesome. Thank you, Josh. All right. So name fields. Name fields are actually, they're string fields. And by string, that just means a string of characters. It's kind of the most basic type of metadata. It's not specifically a number or a currency. It could have text. It could have numbers. And so when you see that, that's what it means. String is just any type of data can go in there. With string and text fields, you've got some options for max number of characters to display. So it will do some auto truncation with an ellipsis there when it's in read mode. This is one of the few examples of a field property that really only applies to read mode. Most field properties are going to be related to data entry. But that can be really, really helpful if you have a string field that's got potentially a lot of information in there. Length counter, that's going to be how we can do that as well. And that's just going to pull from whatever the max number of characters that are specified in your metadata settings. We also have the option for a field renderer to do a password field renderer there. Now, Zach, can you speak to passwords? How does this work in terms of what's available, in the console at runtime in terms of security?
Yeah, so the password renderer is literally just a mask. It doesn't. Okay. The data is still there. All you're doing is just masking it, and that's the same as anywhere you go on a website where you're asked to enter a password or something like that. You're just the text is all there. You just can't see it when you look at the screen.
Okay, cool. Got it. So if I ever forget my password and it's auto-filled and I need to go get to it, I could go inspect the...
Yeah.
the console and get to it there.
Use your JavaScript skills and go grab it. Yep.
But that being said, if you need more security in that, this highlights something important about Skuid. Skuid is not a security layer. We really depend on your security at the database level. And so Salesforce has something called Encrypted Fields. Is that right, Zach?
Yeah, that's true.
Cool. So yeah, if it has to relate to security, again, use your database controls because Skuid is running within the permissions model of what the user has access to. So if you need something to happen outside of that, then you need to be setting that at the database level. Okay,
and
cool. So,
yeah, what you're really showing here is that the field renderer is, and in the V2 pages we call them display methods, is really specifying how do you want this to look. It's not changing the database schema. It's just showing how do you want it to look
right.
Your Skuid page.
Yep. Cool. So something special about name fields is that if it's a name type field, you're going to have an option for the link properties. So this is still relatively new in Skuid. It's available in reference fields as well, because if you're working in a relational database, you want that relationship to show up as a hyperlink so that I can click on it and actually go to that record. And you have some controls over how that behaves. So I think previously, before this was added to Skuid, you had to use a template if you wanted to do that. The challenge with name fields is that a lot of the time you want to be able to edit the name because it's a text value, but when it's in read mode, you want it to display as a link. And so if you do that with a template, that complicates things. So this is really, really great for everyone who's ever wanted to be able to have that ability to edit a name, but then also have some custom behavior in terms of how the link behaved. You don't have to do a template anymore to do that. Okay, so that's some string field properties and then specifically the name field properties. There are other text type fields like rich text and text area where you have a little bit more options. So description is going to be a longer text field. And you have some options here to show the number of rows to display. And that also is going to give you a drag to resize piece. Now, if this was a rich text field, then I would get, if I'm in Skuid platform, I think it's CK editor, is that right? Kind of the standard rich text editor that you get in there. If you're in Salesforce, and that's true in Visualforce as well. In Lightning, you get the Lightning rich text editor. You won't, just so you know, if you're in rich text, you won't be able to get the length counter there. Because it's just too hard to parse it. But you can, I think you can add some CSS to get that dragger, resize dragger. That was a requirement that came up with one customer. So text areas and text fields, a lot of cool things that you can do with those. No special renderers there. I will say this rows to display, when that came out, that was great. That was a really common CSS class. Big text box added all over the place to get something that was obvious that the user could add multiple lines of text. So SEs were really thankful for that. Chris, are you seeing anything here that's touching on stuff that you've been building recently in forms?
Yeah, I mean, all of this stuff, particularly with the string fields and then some of the inline help and the conditional rendering piece that you talked about already. A lot of that display logic allows you to build forms that sort of unfold based on what the user is inputting.
That's a much more poetic way of putting it. I like it.
No, but it's really powerful because especially in places like mobile or something like that where screen real estate is really valuable, that ability to just surface up, the fields that the user needs to see or the data that they need to fill out based on their particular process that they're in is really helpful, and it's extremely easy to set up. And like you showed there, it's not only rendering, but it's also enabling. So
you highlighted something too. Skuid has two component libraries, V1, which works with our theme composer and is is very mature. It's received a lot of iteration over the years. V2 is a new component library that works with our Design System Studio, which is awesome. If you haven't had a chance to get in there yet, the Design System Studio lets you have a scalable design system with style variants for different components. It's pretty awesome. And in V2, there are going to be some things that V1 doesn't have yet. And one of those, you just reminded me of that, is that ability, I think, show inline help. And so this is, I think, pulling from the inline help text that is going to be at the database level. And then you can choose where that shows up as well. And that's going to be on, I believe, most, if not all, fields in V2.
You can also define in field more inline help if that doesn't currently exist.
Oh,
On
cool.
the model, if you're in your model, select a field and you can oftentimes define specific inline help that you want.
Okay, that's awesome. Do you have to override the field metadata? Do you know?
Yeah, it's with overriding the metadata. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, awesome. Oh, there it is. Yeah. So you can do different help text based on, instead of what is in at the database level, or if you don't have any and you want to add it at this level, you can do that too. That's cool, man. Thanks. Cool. Yeah, and actually, while we're here, I do want to highlight something, and we will come back to this. There is an event coming up next week. Andrew Sneed, our pre-sales engineer, is doing a Skuid dive on the Design System Studio. And so if that sounds interesting to you, I'm just going to go ahead and put this in the chat. Please go and register for that. That's going to be really, really cool. We'll bring that up again, at least Design System Studio. That's going to come up a few times today. Okay, so string fields, Textarea Fields. Let's talk about numbers and currencies. So let's see, I've got the amount field here. This is a new opportunity form. In V1, we've got a couple options here. We can choose the number of decimal places that we want. If we want to do something different from what's in our database. In V2, though, we've got some pretty cool new options for numbers. One of those is the slider renderer. So I can take a number or currency field, and instead of it just being a data entry box, I can make it a slider. Have you used this on any forums recently?
Not
Chris?
frequently, but it is really powerful too for contrasting different amounts visually side by side, almost like a living graph or living chart.
I see.
Because then those different amounts are
As
in
opposed to
currency
just being a
fields.
text
Yeah,
number.
just a different way to
Yeah.
display it. If you need to visualize what that looks like in relation to each other, it's
Yeah.
easier to compare, the slider next to another slider as opposed
See
to
if you're
number
way
to-
out of whack.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
good. Awesome. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And then there's also the ability to render it as a stepper. I like all of our verbs that we're using here. So the stepper just gives you a plus and minus, and you can define the increment levels in terms of how you want that to be displayed. So lots of cool options there, and you may be noticing, hey, there's cool stuff in V2 that's not in V1, and that is the case. There are more and more cool things that are being added to V2. V1 is old reliable, and I love it, and it's what I cut my teeth on. It's going to continue growing in stability, a lot of features there. And there are going to be some things in V1 that V2 doesn't have yet. And so there may be times that you want to do something and you might need to build a V1 page for that. And there might be something else, then V2 has everything that you need. So I wish I had kind of an easy go-to. It's not quite as simple as you think, but between the two, you're going to have everything that you need to get what you need done. All right, we got a question here. And by the way, yeah, if you have questions as we go, please use the Q&A there. And looks like someone has already answered. Thank you. All right, awesome. All right, we'll keep going down the list here. So pick lists. Pick lists.
My favorite.
So you had a pick list, with button groups.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a number of options on pick lists in V1 and V2. So I'm actually we'll go over here real quick. So I've got a pick list here. The stage field is, I think, already in here. Yep. All right. So there are a number of ways that we can render a pick list in Skuid. And again, the data isn't changing at all. It's just how it looks. We can render it as a radio button. Let's go see what that looks like. There you go. And this kind of highlights, I think, one of those fine lines to walk when it comes to design. I've mentioned this before, there's a really good blog out there with like the 10 heuristics of interaction design. And I think it's pretty old. There's a bunch of versions of it. One of the ones that they have on there is recognition rather than recall. The idea that you want to show the user everything that they need instead of requiring work from them to have to remember what was the right thing, or do I have to kind of go drill in to find what I need? And so by having a pick list rendered as radio buttons, I can see everything I need to right here. But it is a fine line to walk, because if you have too many options like this, then the user gets overwhelmed. And that's another rule that I heard John Nelson say here at Skuid. He's a product manager on our product team. And I think he lifted this from like a real estate selling handbook, but it's the confused user says no. And I really like that. And so, yeah, if you're overwhelming them with information, then that's not good either. And so you kind of have to think through what's going to be the best option based on what I'm trying to do. And so sometimes you're going to want that drop down, but other times if it's a small enough list, then rendering as a radio button makes it a lot easier for the user to see what they need and just select it instead of having to do 2 clicks and get to it. So those are the kind of things that the users don't, I don't think, realize. A lot of the time it's kind of invisible, but it adds to the frustration, and it piles up over time. So you want to make it as easy as possible. Okay, so V2 also lets you have that ability to render a pick list as a button group. Chris, talk to me a little bit about button groups.
Yeah, no, hold me back if I go too long. This is honestly probably one of my favorite things about V2 and the pick list field renderer as well. One of the things that's awesome that you can see right off the bat is obviously all your options are right there, which is great. So in terms of recognition, that's awesome. But when you're thinking about efficiency and ease of use for the user, so a lot of times on forms or surveys or assessments, you're gathering data from users. And so let's say you have a wizard maybe with 10 questions on it, yes, no, not applicable, whatever it may be. If that's a pick list, then for each of those 10 questions, they're clicking to open the menu, then they're clicking to make their selection.
Yep.
So when we render them as a connected button set, you'd go, if they made the right selection every single time, you'd go from 20 clicks down to 10 clicks, which is a massive gain just in speed as you're trying to collect data from users. But then it's just nice to be able to look up and see, oh, those are the options that I have to answer. Maybe I need to go back and just switch one real quick. I'm not having to drop a menu down, make my new selection, so on and so forth. And another shameless plug for the DSS presentation coming up, because we're displaying as a connected button set, you can design button style variants in the design system. And so you can get really, really specific with the exact look and feel of your buttons in the pick list. So like things like their hover states, their background colors, their borders, their selected states. So when the user, makes a selection on that pick list, you can do some really incredible things there to get awesome look and feel. And, as I mentioned in the beginning, the efficiency from not having to click your drop down. So just some things. I I don't think I use a pick list anymore. I'm always using connected button sets for my pick list.
Okay, so that's kind of interesting. So if I'm going to style that in the DSS, I would go to the button set component
No,
and
so
style that here, or would I do
so
it
start
somewhere
at the,
else?
You start at the button component
Right here?
and you design your
Oh,
button.
I gotcha.
And then you can choose your button group.
Button group, there
and
it
what
is.
button group then when you select there, you can choose which buttons you want to bring into your button group. And
I gotcha.
And then from there, you know, so if, yeah, right there. So if you choose a different one, for example, like primary, or yeah,
Ooh, wow.
something nice and obvious.
Okay.
Yeah, so you design your button and then you choose your button group and then you can bring it in and display it in your pick list.
So that field gets button styles.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Very cool. Yeah. Again, yeah. Please check out next week's Skuid dive on the DSS. That's going to go much more into depth into setting up a design system. But yeah, button groups, totally awesome. Pick lists are great fields to work with, and everyone has to eventually. So it's nice to have a lot of options there.
One last quick thing.
Yeah.
I promise this will be my last thing on this. But so Matt already showed how you can override field labels, which is really cool. This is also helpful when you're doing things like surveys and maybe you want to say things like really enjoyed, neutral, didn't enjoy, things like that. But on your data model, you're scoring that based on integers, you know, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so you can rank something. With Skuid, it's really easy to just change that that UI layer so that the user's not seeing, oh, I'm giving this a 5, and they're kind of doing the math in their head of what their score might be. But they're just presented with, you know, the label that you want to give them in order to answer the question.
Pick list labels, not just the
Yeah,
field
you can
label, the
override
pick list
that.
label itself.
Mhm.
Your pick list values could be 1 through 10,
Yeah.
but on the Skuid side in the UI,
You could
could actually
see
give
A, B,
text
C, D,
values.
or,
Yeah,
you know,
that's
this
cool.
is awesome, this is not as awesome, which is great because then in your data model, you're collecting your scoring that you need, but the UI is pleasant and more kind of human centric for the people entering in the data.
I think the latest survey methodology studies say that you should use awesome or not as awesome in your answers there.
Yeah, it's really not
so
ambiguous. at all.
official recommendation from Skuid.
Say not as awesome.
Not as awesome. Awesome. That was awesome.
Great.
Yeah,
that's
very good. One other cool thing about pick lists is you can choose to add a none option. Now, if that's a required field in your database, then I think you won't be able to do that. You'll have an issue with that. But if it's not, you can add a none option there as well. Okay, cool. So moving on. Oh yeah, another V2 cool tidbit is the ability to do checkbox fields as switches. So checkboxes are nice. Switches are really cool, but Skuid switches, we should call them switches. All right. But yeah, so you get a nice little kind of slider switch that is very tactile and can be great for mobile experiences. Okay, so last thing, and then I want Zach's going to talk a little bit about date and datetime fields, and then configuring fields at the data layer. Before we do that, I do want to point out some of the options for reference fields. These are some of my favorite options in Skuid and properties to configure. Reference fields are really, really powerful, in part because they're little mini models. It's a little model inside a field. And so you can do a ton with it. You can add the fields that you want to display when it's in read mode, when you're typing ahead, what shows up in the drop down, what shows up in the pop-up. And you can do some things like tokenization, how many rows show up when you do that. Your option source, this is really cool. Automatically, it's just going to pull from your database configuration. But you can also set up a model. So for instance, this reference field is the account ID field on opportunity. I could go set up a model that pulls from the account object, and I could put conditions on that model. It only brings in accounts of a certain industry within a certain territory. It could be dynamic. It could be pulled from the user's territory. And so then when the user is filling this out, they could actually only have options that are from that model that we set up. So that gets really, really cool when you get basically all the functionality that you get from a model now in a field as well. And then you can choose which fields you want to search on. That can make things a little bit more performant and more specific. You can also choose to have, at least in Salesforce, when you do a type ahead in a reference field, it's running a SOCL query. That's just a standard Salesforce query. But if you've ever used the Salesforce global search, that uses a different type of query. That uses a SOCL query, which is going to be more performant. You have less control over it, but it's faster. And so if you have a lookup field that is potentially searching across a lot of data, you can choose to go with a SOCL lookup. And you then have the option to pick what types of fields it's searching across. Name fields, all text fields, email, phone, and sidebar fields. Those are the options that Salesforce gives you for SOCL queries. So that can be really, really cool. You also have that option with the search component. If you've ever played with Skuid search, same options, because a reference field is a search field. You have the option to determine how the link behaves, like we did before with the name field. And then you can put filters on a reference field as well. So one note about that, normally Skuid automatically pulls from the metadata that you have in Salesforce and how you've configured it. This is one of the exceptions to that. In Salesforce, you can apply filters to a lookup field, and Skuid does not interpret that. We don't get those controls. So you will often you might have to rebuild that at the Skuid side, but this is going to be how you do it. You can add lookup filters to that lookup field, but there is a ton of control here that is really, really cool, because you can do things like pull dynamically from the running user. You can pull from the record that you're on. You could have essentially dependencies. This is one that got added relatively recently. The ability to look at another.
I have an example of that.
Yeah. Zach, what do you got?
I could show that I could show that during my
Okay.
me, but that one's really cool. I'll show an example of that one.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that lets you do some really awesome things with dependencies by being able to look at another field on the same row to determine how that reference field should be filtered. Okay, yeah. Well, I'll pass it over to you in a second, Zach. The last thing that I wanted to point out that is I just absolutely love about reference fields, calling back to that use case. Let's say you have 50 different record types in your org. But the user, and they might have access to all those, but for the purposes of this page, when they're creating a new record, they only need to see 5 of those. You could apply that filter, and then you don't necessarily want them to type ahead on that lookup field because there's only 5 options. Well, you can render that reference field as a pick list. And now you have all the options that you have with a pick list field. And it's a much quicker process for them because they can just select from those 5 options as opposed to having to type ahead. So that is really cool, and I use it all the time. All right, good question from Jamie. Is there filter logic available for filters on lookup fields? That's a great question. Unfortunately, no, not in the lookup filters piece. But the great thing is that you still have that option because you can do a model sourced field and put your logic on the model. And so at that point, if you need to go that deep in terms of how the data gets brought into that reference field, put your logic on the model and then source your reference field from that model. Great question. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. Zach, why don't you show us that dependency that you're talking about, date fields, and then talk to us about configuring metadata.
All right, I'll switch over here. Let's do this. Okay, go ahead and get started. Okay. Okay, so the first one I want to show is just what Matt was showing with the reference field. So a great example of this is on the Salesforce case object. When you're filling out, when you're selecting the account or the contact and the contact for a case, it's probably going to happen that those are more than likely those are going to be related. Like you want to just select a contact that's related to the account. So for instance, here, if I've selected an account for this case, so Acme 123. Let's say if I want to change it to Acme Engineering, I only want to show the contacts that are actually at Acme. So you can set that up with a lookup filter. So these are both here. I've got a reference field, as Matt was describing, that's displayed as the autocomplete, which is pretty nice for accounts because there's a lot of them. You don't want to show a pick list because there's going to be lots and lots of accounts. Whereas for a contact, there's probably a very small subset of users or subset of contacts that are at a specific account. So it makes sense. There's a small amount to show in the pick list. So over here, I've got, for this account, there's a lot more, but it's still manageable to show in a pick list. And it's helpful to know that I'm only selecting contacts that are actually at this particular account. So that's just kind of a good example of that. And looking at the Skuid page, to set that up is just one lookup filter. You had one lookup filter with the content or the type of filter being another field from row. And basically what you're saying is that when we go look for contacts, I want to just show those whose account ID is the same as the account ID on my case. So that's really all there is to it to get that. So lookup filters are super powerful. And you can do field from another model condition on lookup filters. That's a really powerful one to say like, well, okay, I only want to show records where, let's say it's the same account as maybe the account that I'm looking at in another model. So lots of options there for them to show.
Zach, one other thing that is really cool, I think what you just showed is that, when you adjusted that in the runtime, you didn't have to save that record before that filter kicked in. That's really, really powerful. So especially as users are inputting data or things like that, it's filtering before they have to commit that record to then see the results back. And that's a really powerful kind of efficiency gain in the Skuid UI.
Yeah, it's happening right away. That's a good point. Another thing is that actually it's really nice with mass updates in Skuid is this can do that as well. So if you have, say, Acme, so many Acmes in the demo org, imagine that. You can go filter it, and then you can apply that to all of those records, apply it to Fred. So that's, just the ones that I selected. So, okay, so now I'm going to jump into date time. Let's go back over here. So go to date and date time fields. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning one. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about is on date time fields. When you're picking a date, by default, we don't give you, there's a few things we don't give you. One is we don't give you the ability to select a month and a year that you want to show, but you can add that just by going to the date time field, or this is for dates or date times. So as Matt was showing, the advanced properties panel, lots of good stuff in there. There's one little checkbox. You can check show month picker, show year picker. And when you add these, this gives you, so let me just turn it off to show you this, but if you add the year picker, it also gives you the ability to select the bounds. So there's two different types. One is the selected year, and then the current year, or today's year. So what this is really good for is, let's say that you want to select birth dates. Birth dates, that could be a huge range, depending on your clientele. Maybe you work at a clinic and you only have people that are coming in that are in their 60s or 70s. You might want to like back it up to today minus 60 from today minus 90. So you're giving them kind of a fixed range. Or maybe you're selecting appointments at a clinic or something like that. and you want to say, okay, I just want them to be able to select appointments that are, starting with today, and going to 3 years from now. So I'm limiting to just a few years in my range. So then the user doesn't have, when they go do that, they have, it's very easy for them to see what I'm expected to put in. So people working at your clinic will throw that in really quick. So here, I've got my range 2018 to 2022. So it's relative to the current date.
You don't necessarily want to set something in the past because Skuid doesn't support time travel yet, right? I think that's coming in.
It's coming, yeah.
Q3 2018, actually.
Q5 release. Okay, so that's that one. Another one is the minute picker. Now this is only relevant on date times where you have a time component, but the minute picker increment's really nice. If you don't want to have users select 1 minute increments or 5 minutes, you want to bring it up to say just every 30 minutes, go swap that. And now the minutes is either on the hour or on the half hour. So that can be really useful for kind of constraining the input for the times.
Unless Nautilus Notes is starting at 2:03.
Yeah, that's that makes things hard. The other one, just a small one, is the Show Today button. That gives you the ability to go, you go back to 2022 and you're super lost. You have no idea where you are. It's the future. You want to go back to today. You click today and, oh, it's much better. You're back to today. Dodged a bullet. Okay. So the next one that I want to show is, we talked about daytimes, but we talked about this on the last Nautilus Notes, but I want to show this, kind of talk through this again, is Combo Box. So the Combo Box renderer is something that normally the only standard field that you'll see this, if you're in the Salesforce, is the task or the event object has a field called subject. And that is a combo box, which means that it gives you the ability to have, just show this here, you can have a few default options, but you can also just go do a type ahead and enter whatever you want. So if I go to this unrestricted one, this is kind of what the subject field is like. It says, okay, phone call. You can have a default value where you can go jump ahead and pick that, or you can say with the boss. You can kind of go off you don't have to select the options, but it gives you some suggestions, kind of like defaults that you can pick from, as well as that type ahead functionality. Now the other thing so the way that you configure but that's the normal, that's a standard field in Salesforce. But with Skuid, you can turn any field you want that's kind of a text or even a number or a text area into a combo box. So
I think, you can do it with picklists as well.
Yeah, you can turn a pick list or a multi pick list into a combo box. So let me show that over here. I'll go to this page where I've got my Salesforce data. Actually, I was going to show it with a SQL data source because this is an interesting one. So here, I want to kind of go to the back to Matt's kind of the hierarchy he showed up of where metadata comes from. So here I'm selecting data from a Postgres database, and the metadata from the database is that the industry field is just a text field. That's kind of what it comes. That's what it comes back to us. That's what it's defined in the database table as. But with Skuid, we can override that metadata. And this is something you can do on any data source, any field. Basically, you can go click override field metadata. And then here at the model, you can change how within this Skuid page, this field's going to be displayed. So if I want to show this industry field as a combo box, I just change it to combo box. Now I get a choice of where do I want to give the options? Where do I want to get the options from for the combo box? So I can manually specify them by going over here to pick list entries, and I can enter them in. I could also have a separate model that is the source of all of these. And so this is really powerful, as well as this snippet option. It's basically saying I don't want to have individual pick lists be going and manually entering the entries in. I can have a separate model that defines all of my industry values. And that way other pages, I can go use those as well. So rows in a model is really nice for a pick list source. But here, just for this example, I'm just going to say that, let's say 2 industries are construction and healthcare. Okay, so I got those. And then going back to the combo box properties, it has a really powerful additional capability of being able to restrict the input. So this is nice when you want to give that type ahead functionality, but not let the user break from the set of values you're providing. So let's go do this here. I'll save this. I'm going to go over to my refresh page and change this. So the first column is showing us some accounts from our SQL database. And here we've got all of our industries. So this one already has some in the database, but if I want to, let's see, create a new one. Now I just have two values I can pick from, construction or healthcare. So I pick that. If I try to type something else, oh, that's not valid. So I get blocked and it doesn't actually save. It's not actually taking that value. I can select this and then it's actually valid. It will stay. So that's a really powerful capability of the combo box type. So I think I'm going to go just the one other thing. Let's go to these. I think that's all that I had on those ones. Yeah, I think that's it. So I will turn it back over to you, Matt. I think you're muted.
There we go. You saw my mouth moving and no sound.
Yep.
That's a good question from David about setting default values. That is something else that I believe we can get to with our field properties. And I just wanted to get into that real quick. What's a good example? So let me go ahead and share my screen here.
So you're talking about the which one?
Yeah, so just in general, so David asked how to set a default time on datetime fields if blank, as it's always 12 a.m. and sometimes users forget. And so, you can create validations for that, but is it possible to set that at the Skuid level?
I believe, yeah, the default, you can default it to now. That's it. So you can, if you default it to now, then it should have that as default value. Yeah.
So if you override the field metadata, and again, this is one of the benefits of being able to configure the data, the fields at the data level, is you can add some controls like that. And so, actually, let me pause for a second. This is great too. That ability to essentially convert date to date time and vice versa. Sometimes you need it to work that way for different reasons in the UI. So that can be helpful. But then over here on the right, you have this default items tab. And this is available on basically any UI only field that you create that's not a formula field. And then if you override the metadata for a field at that data level, you can determine what those default values are going to be. And so you could set a default value that gets set, and then once if the user doesn't change it, it just leaves there, and then when they save, it gets committed. So that should be able to accomplish what you're trying. I've never had to do that specific use case, so I'd recommend trying it and seeing if that solves those requirements. Great question. One last thing that I forgot, because I ran into this with a customer, and it is related to multi-pick lists, which are a notoriously difficult field to work with. Really cool, but you've got these essentially comma separated or semicolon separated values that are in there, and it doesn't work quite the way the other fields work. Well, Skuid gives you some pretty cool options for how those multi-pick lists work. Let me go ahead and get into that on this page here. So with multi-pick lists, you can choose to render multi-pick lists as checkboxes. So instead of the user having to click it and drill in to the options to select those checkboxes in a little window, you can actually just display all the options as checkboxes, just like you would with radio buttons in a normal pick list. And the cool thing is that you can have that multi-pick list. I think you can do multi-pick list dependencies in Salesforce. And so you have dynamic checkboxes rendering based on things like record types and stuff like that. So just a reminder, you don't have to do a custom renderer if you want to show a multi-pick list as just checkboxes displayed by default on a screen. And there are some other really cool features in there. The ability to at what point does information summarize for multi-pick list? Because, if you've got 10 items selected, it'll say 10 items selected as opposed to, kind of separating each one out. Well, you can choose to up that to, 15 to be able to show each individual item if you want. And then you can also, this was a new one I didn't know about until we were planning for this webinar. You can choose to set the max number of selectable items in a multi-select pick list. So you can say, pick 3, out of 10 and keep the user from doing more than that. So again, I put this in the community post. This is a rabbit hole and it goes pretty deep. It's a fun one though, because there's so many cool things that you can do with fields. And I would say then when you realize that you can use fields to basically build filters from scratch to get field values, pass those into conditions and actions, it goes to kind of a whole new area there. So lots of cool things that you can do with fields and field properties. Great questions today. Thank you everyone for joining us. I do